Today, I'm going to tell you about a notorious crook and con man who was born right here in North Carolina, but very quickly set out to take advantage of the world around him. This man's name was Gaston Bullock Means. Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Thank you for joining me today, and it's a really pretty day out here. I just got done mowing the yard. The birds are singing, the flowers are blooming. You can see the dogwood behind me if you're watching on YouTube. So I decided to get out in the yard and get out of the welding shop today. I'd rather record out here in the yard. I like the welding shop when I'm welding. I don't like the welding shop when I'm just sitting in there working on my podcast. Now, I got a pretty good episode planned for you today. It's a listener suggestion by Mark from Richlands. Thank you, Mark. But before I get into that, I want to tell you that I decided to take my kids down to Myrtle Beach for the last part of their spring break from school. And while I was on the way home from Myrtle Beach, I decided I wanted to stop by Ellerbe, North Carolina, which, as you know, was home to Andre the Giant, if you listened to my Andre the Giant episode. And when I got to Ellerbe, I got more than I had planned on. I found out it was also home to NASCAR legend Benny Parsons, and it is home to the world's largest strawberry. And I found out both of these things at the Rankin Museum of American Heritage. Now, I had read about the Rankin Museum when I covered Andre the Giant, and I knew Ellerbe was a fairly small town, really small town. So we found a museum. They were open. We pull in, and I'm expecting a small hole in the wall with a few artifacts. I had read that they had an exhibit on Andre the Giant, but I was blown away. This place is humongous as far as small town museums go. The building looks like it could have been an old church, and maybe it was. It's a large brick building. And we go in, and there's a desk right there. I think it cost us $4 a person to look at the museum. So off to the left, that's where the Andre the Giant exhibit was. And there's a life-size picture of Andre the Giant. I'm going to try to cast it up on the screen. But there's a life-size picture of Andre the Giant. And me and my wife and my kids, we took pictures next to Andre. But there's the recliner there, and that was Andre the Giant's recliner right there in the museum. And you're allowed to sit in it. And to start with, I felt kind of weird sitting in Andre's recliner because that was his chair. But then I thought about all the other people who probably sat in that chair, and I didn't want to miss out. So I sat down in Andre the Giant's actual recliner that he had in his house. And we looked through some other stuff. I'll keep posting some pictures here on the screen that I took while I was in the museum. But then you leave that front area, and you can see the rest of the museum, and it was impressive. They had full-size exhibits from different places around the world. They had a tremendous arrowhead collection. It had to be thousands of arrowheads and other stone tools made by Native Americans in there. It took us about 30 minutes to walk around the whole museum. Anyway, I'm from the Hillsborough area, or I'm near Hillsborough, and Hillsborough has got a long, deep history, but the museum in Hillsborough really is just a hole in the wall. The Rankin Museum was a real surprise to us. But that's where I also heard about the largest strawberry in the world. So right down the road from the Rankin Museum, there's a market called the Berry Patch, and they sell strawberries plus a lot of other produce. But one of their big sellers, which I didn't partake in due to the size of the line, is strawberry ice cream. And it is sold out of a building shaped like a strawberry, and it's considered the largest strawberry in the world. So if you're ever around Ellerbe for any reason, definitely check out the largest strawberry in the world and check out the Rankin Museum of American Heritage. Now, not far from the Rankin Museum, or not far from Ellerbe, is the Town Creek Indian Mound. And I wanted to go to it, but we were there on Sunday, and the Town Creek area is closed on Sunday. So I'd rather go where I can talk to some people and really see the place. I didn't want to go while they were closed. But I'm definitely going to go back down there to see Town Creek and probably stop by the museum and get some ice cream this time. By the way, if you want to skip all this talking and jump right to the content, check the description below. And right at the top of the description, I'll have when the actual content starts. All right. Well, before we get into the content, I just want to say if you like the show after listening to it, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. You can join the Facebook group by searching the NC Everything Podcast on Facebook. And if you're watching and you rather listen, you can find me on most podcast players. And if you're listening and you rather watch, you can find me on YouTube. Now, you can search me on YouTube, but I have links for all that down below. The Facebook group, the YouTube channel, and the website, which is www.thenceverythingpodcast.com, and the contact button, where you too can suggest an episode for the NC Everything Podcast. Now we got all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the content. Like I said, today's episode was suggested by Mark from Richlands, and he's not sending us to the Outer Banks this time. No, instead, we're starting out around Charlotte. And I do want to say right here at the beginning, this story is pretty unbelievable. I'm surprised there's not more movies made about Gaston Bullock Means. I think he did pop up on a show, Boardwalk Empire. I don't follow that show. I've seen a few episodes. But he popped up on TV a few times, but I'm not sure if there's a movie made about him or not. But there definitely should be. But before I get into Gaston Bullock Means, I need to tell a little bit of his family history. So I want to say right out of the gate, Gaston Bullock Means came from money. You see, after the Civil War, a lot of people in the South, they were really struggling and feeling the effects of the war. And it wasn't uncommon for a lot of people to turn to crime to make ends meet. But Gaston, as you'll soon find out, was doing just fine financially. But he chose to be a criminal anyway. Gaston's granddaddy, W.C. Means, was a planter who made plenty of money off the farm, or plantation. Farm, plantation, it all means the same thing. Well, after the Civil War was over, the farm money, the plantation money, it took a pretty big hit. So, one of W.C.'s sons, William Gaston, headed over to Memphis, Tennessee to study law, and he was hoping he could help the family out with his law business. Well, he must have done a pretty good job, because he ended up practicing law from 1872 till 1874, and then he was elected to the mayor of Concord. Eventually, he made it to the North Carolina legislature. He was bringing in pretty good money, but it was dirty money. W.C. Means was known to be a crooked and mean lawyer. Well, he marries a Mississippi woman, and she's the heir to a fortune herself. Her name was Coralie Bullock. Well, William and Coralie end up having 7 children, but the first child was born on July 11th, 1879, and they named him Gaston Bullock Means. Now, all the Means kids were known to be troublemakers, but Gaston was known to be the worst. Like his father, he was really mean. You might say he was the meanest Means. Early on in life, he stole some money out of his mama's pocketbook, and the nurse was blamed for it and eventually fired. And Gaston, he was pretty tickled by this. And, watching everybody kind of blame her for this, he never once spoke up to defend her. But he had kind of a quirk. Even though he was into lying, stealing, and manipulating people, he kind of had this high hopes of becoming an investigator like his uncle, who was employed by the U.S. Secret Service. Well, Gaston, he would get a taste of investigative work, if you want to call it that. He would track down, stalk, harass, and rough up potential witnesses who would testify against his daddy's cases and make them change their testimony or refuse to even speak. So he was a henchman, really, not an investigator. Well, in 1898, at age 19, Gaston begins his pre-law education at UNC Chapel Hill. Of course, back then it was just UNC, no Chapel Hill needed. He never graduated, though. He quit school during his 3rd year at UNC. And I couldn't really find out why he quit, but maybe he was just a lazy ass. I read that he made the UNC football team, but he kind of gave a half-assed effort, and so he didn't really do much. I feel like Gaston Means was always after the biggest result for the least amount of input. In 1900, right after quitting college, Gaston became a school superintendent in Albemarle, North Carolina. And yes, you heard that right. He can't hack it at school, so he becomes the leader of a school. Anyway, I really don't know how that happened, but I got a feeling some lies were cooked up during the job interview. During the summer, when school was out, Gaston worked at Cannon Mills. Cannon Mills is a textile factory that I talked about in my Kannapolis episode, which was episode 75. I doubt Gaston had to lie to get that job, but his daddy might have. W.C. Means was a lawyer for James W. Cannon, So it was like, you scratch my son's back, and I'll scratch yours. Eventually, Gaston moved up in the company enough that he became a traveling salesman. And this is how he was first introduced to the hustle and bustle of New York City, New York. Eventually, he'd settle down in the Big Apple. But it didn't really last too long because it turns out Gaston lied. What a shocker. He was being sued by a girlfriend he was seeing up in New York for breach of promise, and I had to look that up. Apparently, if you say you're going to marry somebody and you back out of it or fail to do so, the lady can sue you for breach of promise, and this lady did. So Gaston puts in for a transfer and skips town. I'm sure Lawyer Daddy took care of the fine print and made the lawsuit go away, but I couldn't find anything like that in my research. Anyway, Gaston tucks tail and he flees to Chicago. But even though he was in Chicago, his heart never really left New York. When I say his heart never left New York, he was in love with the city. He didn't really have a whole lot of feelings for that girl who was suing him. He'd go to New York as often as he could, and he never really stopped trying to scam people. On one of his trips to New York, he fell off a bed and claimed to have banged his head pretty good. And so he tries to sue the company that made the bed, but he lost that one. Now, even though he was a liar and a scammer, he did end up with a wife, a Miss Julie Patterson. She was a rich girl from Illinois. Well, now we're at 1914. Gaston's 35 years old, and World War I just got underway. Now, remember when I said he always had hopes of becoming an investigator? Well, that dream came true. Gaston quits the travel salesman bit with Cannon Mills and goes to work for William J. Burns. Burns was a former chief of Secret Service who now ran a crooked and shady detective agency. Now, I'm not saying the Secret Service is crooked, but Mr. Burns sure as hell was. I don't know what all Gaston did for Mr. Burns, and I don't know what led to the next part. But a year after he started at the detective agency, he caught the attention of an unusual man, Captain Carl Boyed. He was the head of German espionage in the United States, and he was really interested in Gaston Bullock Means. Now, it turns out that Gaston was likewise trying to make contact with the Germans in hopes of doing a little espionage business himself. So maybe they kind of met in the middle. I don't know what Gaston's ultimate plan was, but you know he was cooking up something. In April of 1915, he came up with his biggest scheme yet. He would try to get the U.S. riled up with some fake news. He claimed that American sea captains were giving German sailing schedules to British warships. Maybe he was trying to tap into some war profits. People, they love war profiteering. At any rate, his plan failed, and for the first time in his life, Gaston Bullock Means made national news, probably as a laughingstock. At this point, it was no secret that Gaston was working for the Germans, but he claimed that his work with the Germans began before the war and that it was mostly benign. Meanwhile, he was trying to clean out the Germans' piggy bank through extortion. So now Gaston is kind of a shitty double agent and a one-man mob. Speaking of double agent, what was he doing stateside? Well, there was a very wealthy lady named Maud King, and she was being conned out of her money. Not by Gaston, though. Not yet. She's being conned by some shady British guys. Well, the Byrne Agency, the investigator that Gaston worked for, sent him to put a stop to these British guys stealing that lady's money. Well, instead of putting an end to it, Gaston conned the con men into letting him take over the con, and he pushed these guys out, eventually taking control of this lady's entire fortune. Well, then, in 1917, Maud King demanded to see her will. She wanted to make sure that her husband's inheritance went to her. She didn't know that Gaston had already kicked that plan and made himself the heir. Well, he obviously couldn't show her the will that he done cooked up, making himself the heir, so he manufactured a will that satisfied Miss King. But it wasn't long after that Gaston was in need of some money. He must have found a little bit of money because he buys a gun and convinces Miss King to visit Concord, North Carolina with him. She does, and she is shot to death while she's visiting. Now, it never says that Gaston shot her, but it does say that she was shot while in his presence. But ultimately, her death was ruled an accident. But you know how it goes from here. You're judged by your peers, and not just in a courtroom. A lot of people started becoming real suspicious of Gaston Bullock Means. It was around this time that another domino fell. Officials in Chicago found out that the will that Gaston had provided for Miss King was a fake, and an investigation started. The body of Maud King was exhumed, Gaston's apartment was searched, and though Gaston had tucked tail again and ran home to Concord, the long arm of the law scooped him up there anyway. He was arrested in September of 1917, but right away he started planning what he'd say for himself. On the accusations that he had a hand in the death of Maud King and that he manufactured a false will, Gaston claimed that Maud committed suicide and the Germans had framed him. And believe it or not, it worked. He was acquitted. Most likely he was acquitted because of a rigged jury and the fact that the lawyers from Chicago and New York, well, they weren't really well received by the North Carolinians. Gaston kept to his Concord hidey-hole for a while, but eventually the city life drew him back. Both cities, actually. He left North Carolina again to live in Chicago and then packed up and moved to New York again. This is when he started acting like he was turning over a new leaf. He sought out military intelligence officers and told them about the Germans he was working for, but they really didn't give him the time of day. By now, Gaston was a pretty infamous con artist. But he didn't give up. He appeared before a Senate committee to spin his stories about German espionage, and they too told him where he could go. I haven't mentioned much about Gaston's wife, Julie, but during all this, she had been pregnant 3 times. Sadly, the first was a stillborn, but in 1916, she gave birth to a daughter and then a son in 1917. Unfortunately, the daughter died in 1921. As crooked as Gaston was, he took the death of that daughter pretty hard. He headed back to North Carolina to find some peace, but instead, he cooked up his next scheme. He decided to go after the Southern Express Company, who delivered packages by rail. He tried to claim that he had sent $57,000 through Southern Express to Chicago, but when the receiver opened the package, it was just a block of wood. I guess he thought Southern Express was just going to apologize for the inconvenience and hand him $57,000. Well, they didn't. Then, in 1921, a new plan basically fell into his lap. His former employer, Crooked Mr. Burns, was promoted to the head of the FBI. Gaston gets Mr. Burns on the phone and he starts stretching his ear. And before you know it, old Gaston is now a special investigator for the FBI, which really means he's back to being a goon. Now, I told you this story was wild. So what Gaston does is study the FBI's criminal records, then he starts extorting people. He offers to sell information to suspects who are trying to avoid prison. He claimed that for a price, crucial evidence may suddenly disappear. He promised that witnesses would not testify if the money was right. And he was making pretty good money this way, even though he really wasn't doing anything that they were paying him to do. But I guess it wasn't enough money because he established what they call a paper informer. And what this was Gaston claimed to have hired an informant. Well, the FBI pays the informant. Turns out there is no informer. It just looks that way on paper. The cash payouts were going in Gaston's pocket. He also started working with a gang known as the Ohio Gang. He would shake down and blackmail enemies and competitors of the gang, and then he'd offer protection money for a price. Gaston and the Ohio Gang would rake in money from small-time crooks who were hoping to stay out of the Ohio Gang's way. As you can see, when Gaston started working for the FBI, he wasn't really in law enforcement country. He was in criminal heaven. Unfortunately for Gaston, he couldn't stay below the radar. In 1922, officials who couldn't be bribed caught wind of what he was doing, and he was suspended from the FBI. And so, during his suspension, he became a damn customs agent and worked for the Treasury Department. I am not making that up. And this whole time, even on suspension, he worked out of his office at the FBI. And this really pissed off his new boss, the man who took over for Mr. Burns. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. Always the friend, Mr. Burns, when he finds out that J. Edgar Hoover was on Gaston's ass, he sent him out of Washington and up to New York. However, this was the beginning of the end for Gaston Bullock Means. You see, during all this crooked money stuff, Gaston had a crooked money man to handle all his crooked transactions. Well, this money man signs a receipt for a man named Charles Johnson. Like most of the people Gaston had been ripping off, Johnson was ready to be done with Gaston Means. So, he had been doing his own little investigation. He had been keeping and collecting incriminating evidence on Gaston Means. In February of 1923, Johnson takes what he has collected and gives it all to the Department of Justice, who was already pretty tired of dealing with Gaston. Well, the Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, anyway, he liked the evidence that had been handed over, and he hires attorney Hiram C. Todd, and they go after Gaston in hopes of prosecuting him and putting him away for good. Well, indictments were brought up, but Gaston, he started stalling, and he was able to hold off the proceedings for the rest of 1923. During this delay, Gaston did what he did best. He thought up a scheme. He would appear before a special committee and more or less claimed that Senator Burton K. Daugherty, I'm not sure if he's related to Harry Daugherty. So we got two Daughertys here. We got Attorney General Harry and Senator Burton, both Daughertys. Anyway, Gaston goes before the special committee, and he says the senator had a huge hatred for the Attorney General, supposedly because the Attorney General was a crook. Well, then Gaston offers to make a deal with the senator for his testimony against the Attorney General, and he was basically laughed out of the building. I mean, I guess he figured he'd pit these two men against each other, and it would kind of take the heat off of him. But this didn't stop him. He doubled down on the scheme and started accusing more high-ranking officials of being crooks, including President Warren G. Harding. And I guess you could say it was a nice try, but nothing really came of it. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years in prison, and he was ordered to pay $10,000 in fines. However, they weren't done. Investigations into Gaston Means continued, and meanwhile, he hid out in North Carolina again. Eventually, he was summoned to stand in court again, and he claimed he was sick and couldn't travel. So they came to North Carolina and dragged him back to court anyway. This was now 1925. And for the second time, Gaston was found guilty and given another 2-year sentence and another $10,000 fine. Well, in an effort to get out of this mess, he continued to claim that the people who were after him were dirty. But ultimately, he was sent to federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia, where he became a spy for the warden. Unbelievable, yet somehow not surprising. Gaston gets out of prison on July 19th, 1928, right after his 49th birthday, and he headed for his hidey hole in Concord. But Gaston met someone while he was in prison, an author named Mae Dixon Thacker. She had heard of Gaston Means' story and wanted to write about it. She meets Gaston, and they agree that she can write the story, and he will be credited as co-author. In 1930, the book, The Strange Death of President Harding, was published and soon became a bestseller. Yes, Gaston Means had convinced this woman that President Harding, who died suddenly in 1923, died from poison that was given to him by his wife. I don't know what else was in the book, but this was the only thing people were talking about. By the way, there are some conspiracy theories about Harding's death, but it's mostly accepted that he died from a heart attack, and there is plenty of medical evidence to back that up. A few years after the book came out, Mae Thacker tried to disassociate herself from the bogus story and make it known that it wasn't true. But once something is written, it can't be unwritten. She may have denounced the story, but Gaston Means continued to benefit from the book. Well, Gaston finally gets out of prison, and what does he do now? He pays a visit to the National Civic Federation and convinces the folks down there that if they are trying to root out communists in this country, he is just a man for the job. And they just let him do that. Was he a keen communist hunter? I don't know. You know how witch hunts go. Check out episode 93 where I talk about Edward Murrow versus Senator McCarthy and the Red Scare. Well, Gaston, he'd simply read a newspaper and say, yep, this guy here is a communist. That was his entire investigation, and the National Civic Federation paid him to do this. Now, while he was collecting federal paychecks, he decided to get in some crook work while he had the money to do so. He takes his family on a road trip, and then he smuggles $4,000 worth of gold into the country from Mexico. Then he heads back and continues to swindle money from the National Civic Federation. Ultimately, he would swindle out about $200,000 from the National Civic Federation. Now, let's move on to his next scam. On March 1st, 1932, the baby of Charles Lindbergh and Anne Lindbergh was kidnapped. This crime would always be remembered as the Lindbergh baby case. And yes, Gaston tried to swindle the Lindberghs. You see, Gaston's wife, Julie, she had a connection to Evelyn McLean. Evan McLean's husband was the publisher of the Washington Post and a good friend of the Lindbergh family. Well, Gaston, he does what he does, and he gets an audience with not only Evelyn McLean, but also Captain Emery Land, who was a cousin to Charles Lindbergh. He had a bold claim that he could recover the missing Lindbergh baby for a price, of course. They must have done some smooth talking because they took him up on the offer, and he became $100,000 richer for it. Though, as you know, Gaston Means had no involvement with the recovery of the missing Lindbergh baby. But greedy old Gaston couldn't leave well enough alone. He hit Evelyn up for another $35,000, and at this point, she had had enough. She gets her lawyers involved, and they start investigating Gaston Means, which ultimately led to his old nemesis, J. Edgar Hoover, to order his arrest. And so, in June of 1932, he was found guilty of larceny after trust and began a 15-year prison sentence. Now, this was some serious time for Gaston. Gaston was first sent to serve his time in Pennsylvania, but to his surprise, he couldn't really smooth talk anybody there. He was actually in danger in Pennsylvania, and so he was transferred to Leavenworth, Kansas. By 1938, still in prison, Gaston became really sick. He had gallstones and he had lost a lot of weight. Eventually, his condition worsened, and prison doctors were forced to remove his gallbladder. Unfortunately for Gaston Means, at this point he began suffering from heart failure, and he died on December 12th, 1938, only 5 days after getting his gallbladder removed. His wife Julie collected his body and brought him home one last time to Concord, North Carolina. Gaston Means is buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Concord. Now, I said early in the episode that I didn't know if there's any movies made about Gaston. There has been a lot of books and stories written about him, but the problem is he was stringing such a story full of twists and turns and lies that it was hard to write anything of note and have people actually believe you. I wouldn't be offended if you didn't believe half the stuff I just said here. I mean, I didn't backtrack all my research I did for this episode, but I'm sure a lot of it came directly from Gaston Means' own mouth. But that's Gaston Bullock Means. It's almost like a Forrest Gump story if Forrest Gump was a crook. And again, I don't know how true any of that is, but it was a really interesting read doing all the research. Mark from Richlands, thank you again for the suggestion. I had actually never heard of Gaston Bullock Means until I did all this research, but once I started reading into him, like I said, it was just such an incredible story. I really couldn't stop reading. And, you know, if you believe all of it, he moved in some just unbelievable circles. Anyway, if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Check out the links below for social media and the contact button so you too can suggest an episode. And I said this in the past few episodes, I have several suggestions already, and I'm trying to do them in order. So if you suggest something now, it's going to be a few months out. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.